So, today I want to talk about Biden, vaccines, and intellectual property. If you've not yet heard, the Biden administration has come out as of Wednesday in favor of suspending patents and intellectual property rights on the major vaccines, including those produced by Pfizer, Moderna, and Johnson& and Johnson. This actually puts the Biden administration in line with a proposal by India and South Africa in the World Trade Organization that was made all the way back in October of last year. And this document is one that I now have on screen. And while I will not be going over it, I'm going to link it in the description down below because I think it's something worth reading and looking at. But the basic premise is that it covers a lot of the issues of the coronavirus and vaccinations and why things like intellectual property rights may pose certain barriers for certain countries to be able to get access to it. And so when we talk about this and the idea that this information was really available in October, we have to recognize that the United States and the European Union, knowing their positions, should have acted far sooner, as all of this extra time has allowed for the development of currently existing and likely future mutations of the coronavirus. But that said, this policy shift is something that I think we should recognize as good, even if it has come a little bit late. So, I want to talk about this from a few different angles. I want to address why this policy shift was necessary in the first place. I want to talk about the significance of Biden addressing this need and why the European Union really needs to do the same. And I further want to talk about, and we'll disperse this information throughout this conversation, about the economic factors involved in this decision and potential outcomes economically that might come from it. So, first and foremost, I want to talk about the main reason why the issue of intellectual property has been a problem concerning these vaccines in the first place. And the big reason for that is that it has caused a production and distribution bottleneck and slowdown given the way that the vaccine is being handled by the patent holders. Under the current model and the way intellectual property rights are being enacted, other nations and their equivalent companies to these patent holders have been left with basically two options. Either they purchase product directly from companies like Moderna and Pfizer, or they attempt to individually negotiate contracts for licensing of the formula. Now, this is an arduous task that takes time, and that is something we really don't have a lot of in this particular case. And to make matters worse, the desire for these licenses has been generally denied by these companies who have preferred to take full control of supply chains rather than share their formulas in any regard. Now, this effort and maneuver by patent holders has been a purposeful situation to control the supplies and demands of vaccine. Basically, in controlling the full supply chain, they now control, again, the supply of the vaccine when demand is overwhelming and everybody effectively needs this vaccine. This drives up the price and makes it extremely profitable for these companies who know very well that no company can produce enough of these vaccines for the entire world, especially as we get mutations, especially as we have talks about boosters for the vaccine being needed in the coming months or years. So, this selfish profit motive has effectively left the entirety of the globe in a position where they are relying strictly on patent holders like Moderna and Pfizer, meaning that facilities across the globe that may have the effective capability to produce vaccines or may be able to be adapted to produce vaccines, those facilities are now idle, inactive, and unable to move forward in the process of their production for more vaccines at a quicker rate. If they were able to do this, there would be a wider and quicker distribution that could otherwise prevent mutations and other issues in terms of the world being able to save lives. Effectively, we have an issue of mutations and life loss because we are literally on a clock in how this virus spreads. So far from providing an efficient model for the best interests of people, this component of our system has actually created an inefficient production that has led to an inefficient distribution that has led to the loss of life and the potential of a mutation of the virus, effectively causing active harm. So if we can all, for the most part, believe that the primary focus of the world during this pandemic should be to focus on strictly saving lives and preventing the further spread of this virus, then the goal, rather than that of profit and control of a intellectual property right and patent by a specific company, as well as the specific control of supply chains by companies, should the goal should be to get the vaccine into as many arms as possible, as quickly as possible. In doing this, we again allow for less infections, which translates to less mutations, and in a global world that it needs to be recognized, really, that a mutation on one side of the globe will at some point reach the other side of the globe. Despite the fact that we have all of these fictional lines that we like to create and talk about on a map that define nations and territories, this virus will cross that threshold. And just that's the nature of the way that humans have interacted, that we have contact, and the way that viruses spread. They will cross borders, and a mutation that occurs halfway across the world will reach a place like the United States or the European Union at some point. And eventually, a mutation will happen that will break through the capacities of the vaccine to keep people safe. And so, this is the situation that the world, but more specifically the European Union and the United States, have found themselves in. And in those two cases, the US and the EU are specifically in a place where their companies functionally remain in charge of the supply chain of these vaccines. And these two forces maintain a global monopoly on the supply, in addition to their ability to purchase large quantities from these companies and effectively hoard vaccines for their own citizens, which is a detriment to the rest of the world. Now, Biden coming out in favor of removing these barriers and eliminating the barrier on intellectual property in particular actually marks a small shift from the expected neoliberal position of private interests that I believe we all expected him to take. This is something really unexpected, at least for me. And I think it's almost as unexpected as his recent repudiation of the idea of trickle down economics. This is not what I expected, or I think anybody expected when Biden took office. Now, whether Biden himself is aware of it or not, this repudiation of the current system is a marker of a crack in the thought process that has left the world privatized and in the hands of a lot of wealthy companies and individuals on a global scale. And for each issue like this one, it gives progressives and leftists a little bit more leeway to point out the flaws in our current system. When we see these, particular ideas where we can pinpoint how interests are not aligned and how it is against the interests of most of the people in the world, we can point out how these particular sets of policies end up being more negative for people as a whole. And further, it allows politicians that may be more sympathetic to either at least social democratic, if not leftist perspectives, say someone like AOC, to call out and criticize other components of the system. And one of the things that I'd like to point out is a tweet from her where she basically responded to the loss of profits, which I'll talk about in the very near future in this video. Her response to that was basically, let's do insulin next. It is these moments where you get to criticize and draw correlations from one issue to another that can often help bring about social ideas and changes. And we as leftists can utilize this in talking about policy shifts. Now, while it's horribly insufficient, this move by Biden, towards the movement to democratize the global economy, or even, democratize workplaces, or move towards the world that I think a lot of leftists really want to see, I think we should be able to acknowledge that Biden's policy on this one issue is good. And in the current state of affairs of the world, it's probably about what we could expect in terms of good from Biden himself. The Biden administration keeps shocking me, actually, on these very small issues, or very small ways on these larger issues, I should say. And while we all can point to the numerous policies in his administration that have been vastly inefficient, both domestically and abroad, we should acknowledge that he at least got this one right, at least on the surface. And that's worth noting, that the things he is getting right are pleasant surprises. And we kind of have exceeded the really low bar that I think we all set for him when this administration took power. Even if it's not perfect and what we'd like to see, this policy shift is good. And again, it's something that I think leftists can latch onto moving forward in policy discussions. As I firmly believe in all of this, we should acknowledge the good, and we should never let the perfect, the world that we perfectly desire, be the enemy of the good that we see in these moments. Now, it needs to be noted that Biden coming out and supporting this position has done effectively three things, which are really worth noting. The first is that it's caused a significant drop in the price of the stocks of the vaccine companies, including a 6 to 7% drop in the value of Moderna within the span of a day. Now, going back to that same AOC tweet that I looked at, that was in response to something from CNBC Now, which stated that Pfizer, BioNTech, Novavax, Moderna all had plunges in their stock prices, with Moderna going down approximately 7%, Novavax going down 6%, BioNTech going down almost 4%, and Pfizer in the 1 to 1.5 range. Now, this is something worth talking about because of two different reasons. First, the price of these vaccines were increased and inflated because of the planning that was involved by governments ordering both large supplies and providing funding to these institutions in the first place. BioNTech was largely funded by the German government, and Moderna and Pfizer were funded through pre-orders and this kind of hoarding that the US government went through in pre-ordering a large supply of the vaccine. And in doing this, they made the stock prices go up in the first place, meaning that this has been an increase because the governments of the world have put funding into these companies. Second, it provides us another example of how for-profit motivations act counterintuitively to public need. What is profitable is not always good, and what is good is not always profitable. The medical sector is often a place where we see this misalignment of priorities between markets and people, and the way that the distribution of these things and the desire to innovate ends up getting stifled. I think, secondly, this position from Biden begs the question on how the US might want this to manifest in terms of world policy. Yeah, it seems as if that we're aligning ourselves with the proposal from India and South Africa. But what are going to be the devil of the details? The best option for all of this would be a situation in which a tech transfer occurs. What that essentially means is that the vaccine companies would be, in some way, shape, or form, given some sort of, reasoning or desire to provide technical know-how and personnel to ensure safe vaccines are produced around the world. So they would send information on the technology that is used to create it, to store it, as well as the formulas themselves, and provide personnel in some way, shape, or form to look over and examine the production to make sure vaccines are safe. And this form of tech transfer would be, again, the best option because it would allow for the safest version of production to occur. Now, how would you convince these companies to do that? That's something the US would have to negotiate and work out. Now, The worst option for all of this, to me, is one in which the other countries of the world besides the EU and the United States, who have largely gotten enough supply of the vaccine, are asked to essentially take these intellectual property rights as a loan, where basically they would be asked to pay back for the patents a fee at interest at a later date. So effectively, they would be leased these patents and the intellectual property rights, where they'd have to pay it back later. Far from being an effective tool, it might lead to later issues of poverty for a lot of these nations, where they are put in the same neoliberal and neocolonial cycles, where they are effectively controlled by private interests at essentially gunpoint. Because if you don't get these vaccines, you really don't have a way to, provide for your people. So you're basically being told this is the only option you have to protect your people, pay us back. It's kind of a form of extortion. And it's one that would really provide a bad situation for the world as far as I'm concerned. It would ignore the needs of people and put a lot of countries in a precarious position. We should, at the very least, be providing a situation where these intellectual property rights are provided for free, especially since they were funded by governments in the first place. But time will tell, and we'll see how things manifest. But I think it really does hinge on the third thing that Biden doing this does, which is it now passes the issue into the hands of the European Union. Now, why is it that the European Union is in any way, shape, or form involved? Well, as the New York Times points out, support from the White House is not a guarantee that this waiver can and will be adopted. It is a huge push in that direction, but it doesn't supply all of the conditions necessary. Again, it's a necessary but not sufficient condition. The European Union is what's standing in the way because they have to agree to it because the changes to international intellectual property rights require a unanimous agreement. So without the European Union coming out and supporting this particular perspective, it will effectively do nothing that Biden has come out in support of it. So the question is, with Biden coming out in favor of it and the US generally lagging behind the European Union in terms of, policy shifts like this, especially ones that are beneficial to the world and, to people as a whole, what would be a reason that a place like the European Union might want to or desire to go against such an obvious good that even the US has come to support? Well, there's a question that's often proposed by those in favor of private planning and distribution models. Namely, if the pharmaceutical industry has agreed that a suspension of patent protections would undermine risk taking and innovation. So basically, the argument boils down to who will make the vaccines next time, who will have the incentive to work on these particular things. And the truth of the matter is that it's an important question that needs to be asked whether or not this for-profit model ends up creating a system where if we end up producing a global vaccine, if it will make it such that nobody will want to produce the next vaccine because there will be no economic interest. That question in and of itself proves an issue in for-profit systems because if you are in a world where there's no incentive to financially produce something, if it's given out in a way that actually makes it effective, what's the point in producing it in the first place? But the larger question, and I think the larger thing that needs to be noted, is that this is exactly how we handle the flu every year. The way the flu is handled is that research is coordinated and shared amongst world organizations. And on a global scale, it's distributed and produced in a way that is economical for the world because we recognize that the flu shot is a benefit to the world. And so by sharing information and thus sharing the production and distribution, it makes it accessible to more people on a global scale. To further add to this point, most innovations like these themselves, came from publicly funded dollars, including much of the vaccines and everything else that is produced. These ideas and innovations usually come from national health services, who actually work on some of the riskier research. Companies are actually quite risk averse. If your goal is to produce quarterly gains, you don't have the desire to produce something that might produce wealth maybe 10 or 12 years down the line. Your goal is how you can optimize your gains in the next quarter or the next annual cycle, meaning that you don't want to do something that might be risky or might tank your profits even in the short term for a long term gain. Companies don't have the incentive in our current structures and system to do these risky research projects that may not amount to much or anything. So they prefer safer systems that rely on reproducing the same ideas in varied and different ways and to produce very simple methods that offer treatments rather than cures. Again, as I stated earlier, profitable things like long-term treatments are not necessarily compatible with the things that are good for a society. Things that leave people in these long term cycles that last for years and leave people dependent are not nearly as good for people and are far more profitable than cures and short term treatments like antibiotics and vaccines. Generally speaking, when you're looking at those, they provide a greater good for people and the world as a whole. So it's usually national health services and government institutions that end up funding or putting money into antibiotic and vaccine research. Because again, it conflicts with the way profit models work and the short-term risk aversion, system that markets often produce. So quite to the contrary of the myth of a for-profit company already, doing all this work and being the people who innovate, they actually do not create nor have an interest in creating some of the best medical innovation for our world and societies. And this is an important, idea in recognizing all of that, because it is examples like this one that show that it is actually nationalized and internationalized efforts that actively create the best outcomes for people over profit margins. So, although this is coming late, and I'm glad to see the Biden administration recognizing the inefficiency of our current system, and even in this small way setting a precedent for future cracks in the system to reveal themselves, hopefully the European Union follows suit, and we can attempt to try to limit the damage that's been done from the mutations that have occurred between October and now, and the ones that might occur in the near future because we really slowed this process down a great deal. And by opening more production, we create more distribution channels. And hopefully, by distributing this more effectively and at much larger scales, we're able to help stop the spread of COVID-19 and save lives and effectively stop mutations so that we don't have to go back to square one and create an entirely new vaccine and end up having to reproduce this whole cycle. So with that said, if you like this video, give it a thumbs up, hit the subscribe button and bell for notifications. You can follow me on Twitter and check out my Discord in the description down below. My name is Anarchist Tara, and I hope you enjoyed watching.